Welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, your blog and podcast for all things international development, analyzing global injustices and building solutions for a better world. Hello, and welcome everybody to another special edition of Contrarian Humanitarian Live, Episode 8, Critical Conspiracy Theory, Part 1 today, Cultural Marxism and Culture Wars. My name is Erin Edmiston, Contrarian Humanitarian creator and typical host, except for today. The main host will be our master producer, Mikey Pogoloff.
What up? Can you hear me?
Okay, there you go. Nice. Okay, so y'all are going to be in for a treat today, as with all of our shows. We have Andrew Woods here, philosophy PhD candidate, and we will be joined later on by Sam Hoadley-Brill, another philosophy PhD candidate. But before we get into that, I just want to briefly lay out the show for today and part 2, which will be July 2nd at 1 p.m. with Dr. Nathan Cartagena. So as I said, Mikey will be the host for today, as what we're going to be talking about today is really his kind of area of expertise with history and conspiracy theory and all that good stuff. So Mikey will be hosting part 1 today, Cultural Marxism and Culture War. Just to say that this series sort of picks up from our pilot series. And if you haven't listened to our pilot series, please check that out on Spotify, SoundCloud, and contrarianhumanitarian.org. It picks up from our pilot series, which is called Globalist to Globalization. So please listen in. And then for today, and then part 2, what we're going to do is link what our discussion today with the history of international humanitarian efforts and decolonization movements. So if you're curious about how conspiracy theory inevitably links up to international humanitarianism, that's what we do here on Contrarian Humanitarian, one of the many. So definitely stay tuned for today and part 2, again on July 2nd. And please send in your questions if you have any in the chat box, and we'll do a Q&A session at the end. So I'll give it to Mikey, and then I'll come back at the end for the discussion. So take it away.
Thanks, y'all. We are having some serious technical difficulties today, so I'm just going to be kind of trying to patch this together. Appreciate you bearing with us. I do have some media I wanted to play, so we'll see if I can play it. If I can't, that's all right. But in the immortal words of Bill O'Reilly, fuck it, we'll do it live, right? So, just an introduction, as Aaron mentioned, this is really building on a lot of our pilot series and my background research in conspiracy theories and digital media. I do hope that this will be a broader discussion that goes deeper than even the pilot series does, because I want to be able to give historical context without everybody just feeling like what we're saying is everybody who criticizes critical race theory is a Nazi and all of this stuff is fascist. I'm going to try to editorialize not too much today and just leave it up for people to sort of make their own decisions. But I do think there is some room around the discussion of fascism, when to apply that term, especially in American politics. And we cover a lot of that in the podcast. And so why do we talk about these things? How does conspiracy theory and fascism play into the recent critical race theory panic sort of that we're seeing, or if you just want to call it drama, controversy? Well, just real quick, in episode 1, at least, we go through a whole slew of things that are important to understand for the context of where we're at today. We sort of start today with QAnon and the sort of fascistic tendencies behind that, anti-democratic tendencies, blood libel with the adrenochrome stuff, and that takes us into the broader anti-Semitic themes that a lot of conspiracy theory borrows from. We touch on banking conspiracies and Rothschilds, protocols of the Elders of Zion, and how these kind of things mimic fascist propaganda from the past. We touch on the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. We're going to talk about the Judeo-Bolshevik worldview or conspiracy theory, how this overlaps with the Klan and America and American culture and different elements of American culture like the Klan or potentially America First as sort of proto-fascist. We talk about Father Coughlin, an important American fascist character, Henry Ford and Hitler, the crossovers there, the American Nazi movement or the German-American Bund, fascist businesses and CIA ties, the United States eugenics movement, and, you know, speaking of fascist foreign policy stuff, CIA, you know, fascist movements in foreign policy that we have supported, open fascist movements throughout the years. So, you know, people aren't pulling the fascist stuff just completely out of nowhere. I think that's important to understand. We're talking about historical context. Some people get angry and say, oh, you're just saying everything you disagree with is fascism or Nazism. Well, I don't personally think that's the case, but there is a lot of historical context to this. I do think we need to use some nuance, especially when we're complaining about how a lot of critical race theory or anti-racist rhetoric paints everything in a broad monolithic picture, so that, say, anything that is social justice related gets labeled as communism, Marxist, radical, all these things. And they shouldn't be doing that either. So we're going to try to insert some nuance into this conversation. But with that said, you know, please check out the podcast. Most of that stuff's in episode 1. It kind of comes full circle to episode 4 and 5, where we start talking about identity politics and political correctness. And what we're going to talk about today, critical race theory and some of the controversies around that, and some of the parallels with a similar sort of panic around political correctness and the undertones, again, of another anti-Semitic, arguably fascist conspiracy theory called cultural Marxism. What is cultural Marxism? How does it differ from Marxist cultural analysis in philosophy? What is the difference between a conspiracy theory and the reality? How do we parse the truth out? Why was McCarthy wrong? You know, there was, in some rational view, a threat of communism. There were communist spies, etc. But he went too far. Why did he go too far? How do we parse these things out? So at the end of that episode, we promised that we're going to do another episode at the end of that series, the final episode. And this is us carrying through on that promise. So we've brought on Andrew Woods, who, as Aaron mentioned, is a PhD candidate, and his research focus is in actually cultural Marxism, conspiracy theories. Andrew, do you want to say anything else about who you are and how you got into this field?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm very happy to be here. I really started getting into this topic sometime around 2016. I was living in America at this point. I live in London, Ontario now, but I was there between 2015 and 2017, and I was part of a critical theory meeting group that would sort of gather every month to just have a drink and talk about one another's works. And I think it was about the time of Trump's presidential victory that we decided to turn to some of the Frankfurt School's work on propaganda and fascism that they did in the 1940s and 1950s. And while we were reading or encountering more recent accounts of like Adorno's work on Freudian theory and fascist propaganda, and Lowenthal and Guterman's work on right-wing agitators, we thought we would do what they did, which what they were doing was like looking through the speeches and texts of people like Father Coughlin, who is famous fascist anti-Semite who did speeches over radio. We would do what they did to try and examine the psychological mechanisms and rhetorical devices that these new alt-right agitators were using to peddle their ideology. And for instance, we watched Steve Bannon's documentary Generation Zero to try and figure out his particular right-wing brand of economic populism and how it would relate to the policies of the Trump administration. And as part of this kind of informal collective project, I started to read Breitbart every day, and especially their articles on the left. And what struck me was that none of these articles really offered a definition or a realistic assessment of the power of the left in the United States. And it was always well, there was always this sense of demonizing the left for everything that was being everything that was going wrong in America. And it resonated with me with a quote that Lowenthal and Guterman used to describe portraits of the enemy in the speeches and work of right-wing agitators in Prophets of Deceit. So they say, well, while in other movements, defeat of the enemy is a means to an end in a new society or a reformed society of one sort or another, in agitation, it is an end in itself. The enemy is not conceived of as a group that stands in the way of achieving a certain objective, but as a super oppressor, a quasi-biological archdevil of absolute evil and destructiveness. He is irreconcilable, an alien body in society which has no useful productive function. Not even in theory is he amenable to persuasion. There is no bridge which the enemy can cross for repentance. He is there forever, evil for the sake of evil. And this is what I kept on coming across in Breitbart day after day in these articles about the left. It's not a matter of trying to win these Democratic Party voters over to your side in the local and national elections. They're just a unrepentant foe that's there, evil for the sake of evil, as they wrote. And when I was sort of scrolling down into the comment sections of these articles, I kept on coming across this list called the 11 Aims of the Frankfurt School, usually accompanied with comments like the Frankfurt School plotted what we're going through right now, the destruction of America. And the list includes stuff like, the promotion of excessive drinking, the undermining of schools and teachers' authority, control and dumbing down of the media. And I was part of a critical theory meeting group, and I'd just done my MA in critical theory, and so I was familiar with the work of Adorno and Horkheimer and Erich Fromm and all of those other Frankfurt School thinkers, and I couldn't really reconcile what I had read in their work and what was being promoted about the Frankfurt School in this list. It was almost entirely contrary to what they thought and said. Adorno, for instance, Adorno and Horkheimer had this whole critique of the culture industry, so they were opposed to this dumbing down of the media. So I did a little bit of digging to see where this idea of the Frankfurt School was coming from, and this is where I started to come across articles about the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, notably Martin Jay's article in Salman Gundy, where he talks about its history and how it was being used in the American New Right and in various Tea Party circles. And I started coming across other sources as well that talked about how it wasn't, this narrative wasn't limited to Breitbart comment sections. It wasn't just limited to America, but it's sort of been transplanted all over the world in a kind of what Johnny Richardson calls a a transnational discourse. So there are people like Anders Breivik in Scandinavia drawing on this trope of cultural Marxism to justify his white supremacist terrorist attacks. There were people like the British National Party in the UK who really emphasized the anti-Semitic components of this narrative. And so it wasn't just a it wasn't just a blip. It wasn't just people on the internet being crazy. This is a sort of narrative that was being promulgated through very serious organizations throughout the world with various serious political objectives. And so I started to write about it when I went into my PhD program. I wrote about it in a couple of papers, and one of them was published in the collection Critical Theory in the Humanities in the Age of the Alt-Right. Even though I'd done this work, I always felt like I was missing something, like historically or analytically. There was always much more work to be done of fitting the history of this narrative into the history of the American right. Also, the history of the New Left in peculiar ways, the history of, just various different societies like Brazil and Germany, etc. So it eventually morphed into a kind of long-term project. It's now become my dissertation and has really just sort of taken over my life for the past 2 or 3 years.
Great. Thank you for sharing all that. Looks like we lost Aaron there. That's cool. Let's see. I'm going to bring Sam in because he's here.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Hey, Sam. What's up? Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm having some technical difficulties today, so I'm just going to be trying to mute my mic when I'm not talking and whatnot. But I wanted to see if we can play some media. I lined some up. If not, because of the technical difficulties, we'll just skip over that. But give me 1 second, and audience, bear with me, and we'll see if we can do this. Let's see. We want to share audio and this screen. Okay. All right. That seems to be working. This is a John Birch Society documentary.
I actually just watched this the other day.
Did you watch the whole thing?
Yeah.
It's pretty wild. John Birch Society, if you don't know, we talk about that in the podcast as well. Generally understood to sort of be on the fringe extreme right of the early modern contemporary conservative movement. Probably started in the late 40s, I think. And during Buckley's rise, I always want to call him Jeff Buckley. He basically was sort of the more moderate, represented the more moderate wing of Republicans and kicked them out. And the kind of stuff that a lot of people say they weren't really kicked out. They've always been around. They came back. They're the Tea Party. They're QAnon. They're all these things that we see now. That's up for debate, I think. But one of the things that they really pushed that, made them fringe is that the whole civil rights movement was a communist plot. And that, there weren't really any real grievances that the humanitarianism and the civil rights activism of these people in the 60s and the Civil Rights Act and all these things were really just Marxist communist plots to undermine American Western hegemony and to set people against each other, to divide us. So, this kind of rhetoric has been used a lot. So let's play a little bit of this.
can't hear. Can they hear the audio?
I feel like Mike may need to have his mic on. So
Could you hear it at all?
I didn't hear any audio.
All right, let's let's try it one more time.
The communist plan for the conquest of the United States was explained to the American comrades by Moscow's agent, Joseph Pogani. Pogani was sent to
Can you hear it?
by Stalin.
Yeah, maybe turn it up a little.
Groundwork for the agitation that would eventually develop into a Negro revolutionary movement. American Negro Problems was published in 1928 by Joseph Pogani using the alias John Pepper and carried the official communist line for America. The Workers' Communist Party of America, in its fighting imperialism, must recognize clearly the tremendous revolutionary possibilities of the liberation movement of the Negro people. The Black Belt of the South, with its starving and pauperized Negro farmers and Negro agricultural working classes, with its Jim Crowism, its semi-feudal status, and its political system still bearing the earmarks of the period of slavery, constitutes virtually a colony within the body of the United States of America.
Let me just see if I can get this one more part.
By this time, the communist champions of the Negro race had hidden the revolutionary ideas and slogans for a Soviet Negro Republic behind the humanitarian banners of jobs, security, civil rights, and peace.
Okay, sorry if that wasn't loud enough for people. We were having some technical difficulties. I think we'll skip through most of the media from here moving forward. But if you couldn't hear that, basically what it was saying is that it took a few communist thinkers and ideas, particularly from earlier in the 30s and 40s, and said, hey, part of their plot was to radicalize black people, and maybe even there could be like some kind of USSR, Soviet Republic of the black people in the South and the Southeast, where there's a lot of high black populations, et cetera, et cetera. And then they fast forward to 1965 during the Civil Rights Movement and say, hey, everybody who's fighting for equal rights, humanitarianism, better jobs, all these things, all of that is actually just a secret communist plot, and they know it and they're hiding it from you. So I see a lot of that kind of stuff happening today. I don't think all of the sort of fascist overlaps and parallels that people talk about are all valid, but I think when we talk about comparisons, the biggest ones I see is with this sort of McCarthyite, neo-Bircher, Red Scare type stuff from the 60s when they were saying, hey, everything that is social justice related is actually just a communist plot. And then we fast forward to the 90s, and we'll get into this in a moment, with William Lind and the Free Congress Foundation and cultural Marxism. And that's when you sort of see a rehashing with all this stuff, but more applied to feminist studies, gender studies, blacks, any kind of studies that, you know, is outside the purview of traditional hegemonic areas of education is considered PC studies, and they throw it all under this cultural Marxism label and say it's a plot to bring down the Western world. So getting into that and cultural Marxism and what it is, let's let Andrew take the floor a little bit. I know that a lot of people, including myself, who might be familiar with cultural Marxism, probably would have assumed it came from a traditional sort of paleo-conservative type person or ultra-conservative like Pat Buchanan. But that's actually not the case. The original sort of origins of where it came from, although I'm not sure it took on the nomenclature till later, actually lies with somebody Andrew called, his name is Lyndon LaRouche. But he's generally just understood as a crank, a conspiracy theorist. Let's see. Anyways, yeah, a crank, a conspiracy theorist, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just let Andrew take the floor since he's the expert here and give a little like synopsis, a brief definition of what cultural Marxism is, and then get into the genesis of where it came from. Let's start with the LaRouche stuff, and then we can get into some of the later stuff with William Lind and how it carries through to today.
Thank you, Michael. That's great setup for looking into the history of this idea. I mean, it is true that LaRouche was and his followers were really the progenitor, but when it got picked up by Lind and Buchanan, it really started to take on the qualities that we see in it today. I think when it comes down to it, cultural Marxism has sort of become a one-size-fits-all explanation for anything that the speaker or the writer dislikes or decides to target in that particular political conjuncture. So it can be applied for political correctness, it could be applied for multiculturalism, it could be applied for Black Lives Matter or Antifa. It's really something that can be a sort of shifting signifier between these sort of different oppositions to various movements. And it kind of functions as an exonym, which is a sort of rhetorical device for pathologizing another group and simultaneously signaling that you're not part of that group yourself. So no one properly self-identifies, except for maybe unironically as a cultural Marxist. It's usually something that's leveled as an accusation. And there is a history of the term being used more neutrally. So like in Trent Schroer's 1973, The Origins of Domination, and Dennis Dawkins' Cultural Marxism in Post-War Britain, and I think we can talk about what differentiates these more sort of academic and staid uses from really the propagandistic uses that you see later. So where we get to it with LaRouche, I mean, you have to start the story somewhere around the late 60s and early 1970s. So
we appear to have lost Andrew temporarily. Lots of good technical stuff going on today. Well, I guess we'll just wait it out, see if he comes back. How are you doing, Sam? You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm doing well. My name's Sam Hoadley-Brill. I just finished my second year in a PhD program in philosophy at the CUNY Graduate Center. I study moral, social, and political philosophy and have, especially in the past year, gotten more into philosophy of race and Africana philosophy. I got into the culture war, conspiracy theory, the cultural Marxism specifically by accident, through my studying of James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and those grievance studies hoaxers, and especially their book, Cynical Theories. So I wrote a review of that and then follow pretty closely James Lindsay's work on the New Discourses blog, and noticed that he was sort of going down a sort of different direction from Helen, where Helen Pluckrose tries to pin everything on postmodernism and Foucault and these French post-structuralist thinkers. And James Lindsay has been going more and more for a while now, and now he's fully embraced it, sort of saying that it's really these Frankfurt School critical theorists that we have to worry about, and Gramsci before them, and Lukács and all these people, although he seems to sort of group them all together under the heading of the Frankfurt School. And how I found it really was I stumbled across this video, the 1998, I believe it was, video that William Lind put together that's called The History of Political Correctness, this sort of attempt at a documentary. And I found it and sort of cut clips up together and made a Twitter thread that was like, really, how is this any different from the sort of anti-woke hysteria that we're getting today? And the thread sort of went somewhat viral. People, a lot of people were talking about it and responding to me and giving me resources. And one of those people was someone who had done extensive research on William Lind and Paul Weyrich from the Free Congress Foundation, and had sort of sent me links to blog posts of his, this guy by the name of Bruce Wilson, who's done a lot of really good research on Lind and Weyrich. And so sent me down a sort of rabbit hole. And then I found out about the anti-Semitic links of the cultural Marxism conspiracy, and how it's sort of a, opportunistic revival of the theme of cultural Bolshevism that the Nazis, literally the Nazis, played on and made central to their propaganda during World War II and the lead up to that. And from there have just been sort of captivated by it in its own right. And now especially seeing it, certain tropes revived, especially in the current right-wing political propaganda campaign against critical race theory, has been especially concerning. And so I have done a lot more research into it since then for that reason.
Thanks for sharing all that. Well, while we're here without Andrew, I guess we might as well just sort of shoot the shit and just kind of discuss this stuff like I had hoped we would more towards the end of the episode. But, I have somewhat of a similar trajectory as Andrew and yourself. I've been kind of in the game a little longer. But in terms of sort of just like stumbling on some stuff and noticing some things and being like, this is interesting. This appears to be a trend. And then like that building and then seeing all these connections. I actually started sort of as a conspiracy theorist myself, if that helps people sort of understand where I'm coming from. Oh no, Andrew had a power outage. So it might be a minute before he comes back on. So we'll just wing it. But I sort of started as a conspiracy theorist, and then I had a history degree, so I started going through the sources of a lot of the stuff I was looking at. And this is when, like you, I started, even though I have a Jewish background, I was raised in like a Christian household. So I wasn't really aware of like what anti-Semitic canards really are. I mean, I knew about anti-Semitism, but I didn't know anything about the specifics. So at first, like a lot of it went over my head, and then I started getting into it and realizing like how much of conspiracy theory at that time, which was really focused on central banking and the Holocaust denial was on a big uptick and various things, how much of this stuff has these fascist backgrounds that is rehashing old Nazi propaganda, and that was a journey for me, especially because being Jewish and learning like, hey, I was kind of trafficking in these anti-Semitic adjacent, at the very least, ideas. But another thing I noticed was that this was getting bigger and bigger, and especially with the internet. And I was worried about it. And prior to Trump really becoming a thing, most people didn't think much about this stuff. And when I would talk to people about it, and I, even when I got to grad school and I started doing graduate sort of related research into this stuff, people were like, what? Why are you concentrating on this? Why do you care? This is weird. Those are fringe people. Just ignore them. What's the big deal? And I was saying, no, this is not a fringe thing. This is getting bigger and bigger, and this is something we need to pay attention to. And then Trump got elected and things started to change, and then Charlottesville happened, and now we're into the QAnon age and flat earth and all these things, and we've gotten to a point of sort of conspiracy saturation mixed with Trumpism, which is this interesting sort of faux right-wing populist iteration of conservatism that draws a lot on past iterations of conservatism that I would argue are sort of fascist adjacent. And this is where we get into an interesting discussion, I think, because I don't want to like pull seniority on you, Sam, as like somebody who's been doing this a long time and like thinking a lot about it for a long time. But I think Andrew will, if he ever comes back, will kind of back me up on this too about we're going to talk about cultural Bolshevism and like, is this the same as all the anti-critical race theory stuff we're seeing today and, you know, cultural Marxism. And what he would say is that cultural Marxism is an inherently American strain of fascistic propaganda. And that's where the conversation, I think, gets really interesting because there's a lot of comparison with Trump, even among historians and in the academic world. Is Trump like Hitler? Are we like the Nazis? You know, are we going down that road? Is January 6th like the beer hall putsch? All these kinds of things, which is, you know, somewhat interesting. I like following these conversations, but I think what a lot of historians, not all, there's a lot of disagreements, but a lot of historians will come back with is, well, American fascism is really its own thing. And there is a play and an interplay and a back and forth between the appreciation of American forms of oppression and discrimination and German forms. And Hitler wrote about this in Mein Kampf. He had an appreciation for our system of genocide, our system of Jim Crow, also our immigration system, which was eugenics-based. There's a lot of crossover with eugenics. A lot of eugenics ideas and research grew out of America and pollinated into Nazi Germany. And when you get into proto-fascist, like before the word fascist was around, and you look at things like the Klan, you know, on some sense you can't call that fascist because the word didn't exist, but in another sense it's very clear that the Klan was a sort of proto-fascist organization. So this is where I think some of the lines get blurred. And one other thing I would say is that one thing that gets sort of overlooked in this discussion, from a more liberal mainstream perspective, I think people who are trying to sort of defend critical race theory, at least against the excesses of the silly critiques, and then we're constantly talking about domestic policy, which is very important and obviously, like, in some ways the most important thing. But white supremacy, I think, can only really be understood through an international lens. So when you, even today, or just through the last 50 years or so, you look at our foreign policy, you know, I think you could make a strong argument that there is where you will find a lot of our white supremacist tendencies that go back further into colonialism and tie into European colonialism and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that's just me wrapping it up, you know. I don't know if Andrew, let me see if he sent me a message or anything. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm gonna mute myself. You wanna just
You muted yourself, so I can't hear what you just said.
think some thoughts. Just say some things.
Speak out loud.
Respond.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I definitely can't claim as much as many years of experience, you know, wading through the source material, learning about this stuff. But I have gotten very interested in it and spent, you know, more hours of my free time than my professors would probably have liked me to, in terms of just researching this stuff to get a good understanding of the background, of the historical roots of certain things, watching documentaries about, you know, the American neo-Nazi movement. He's back. We can hear you too.
Indeed. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Welcome back. Thanks. Shout out to the power for turning back on. But yeah, definitely, I agree, Mikey, in terms of your point about understanding white supremacy through an international lens. Something I really didn't know about basically at all. I mean, I knew on some level, given like, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the United States, but like the deep and international nature of Yellow Peril was something I just really barely knew about, and have been researching that. Ordered a book on it. And like the whole Fu Manchu thing, like I knew that there was this mustache called the Fu Manchu mustache, but I didn't know that, this was like basically like a Frankenstein type character from some, white supremacist dude in Britain, I believe, who came up with this character and then turned into like a worldwide character to demonize Asian people and immigration from Asia, across the white world. And yeah, so I definitely agree in terms of understanding it on an international level, and in terms of the KKK being proto-fascist, totally agree with that as well. And the neo-Nazi party, I mean, the American Nazi Party with George Lincoln Rockwell is something I also only recently started to get into, but the history there is terrifying.
Well, thank you. Well, we were just kind of shooting the shit while you were gone, Andrew, trying to fill space. We did sort of start bridging the gap from the LaRouche stuff into Lynn, but if you just want to pick up anywhere in there, that'd be cool.
Well, no, during the power outage, men in balaclavas broke into my house and told me that I cannot speak ill of Lyndon LaRouche. So all I have to say is Lyndon LaRouche is great. We should all follow LaRouche.
I've been there, man. And sometimes you have to pull some punches because people might actually fuck you up.
Yeah, indeed. No, no, seriously, I think we can. Well, I mean, what do you think would be helpful to fill in the gaps in this chronology, so we can
maybe some talk about Minnicino and the 1992 essay that kicked everything off.
Okay. So I think that's a good place to start. But really, it is I think the culmination of various demonizations of the Frankfurt School in LaRouchian ideology. That 1992 Minnicino essay in Fidelio, I think something like the New Dark Age, Frankfurt School, and Political Correctness. It brings together what they were writing what the LaRouchians were writing in the early 80s about Adorno being, responsible for radio, television, and using those technologies to dumb down the masses. It also incorporates certain stories that they planted about, Marcuse sort of brainwashing or engineering the figures in the New Left to support a sort of kind of global fascist regime. So they used it to sort of smear Mark Rudd of the Weather Underground and Angela Davis of, at the time she was leader of the Communist Party of the United States of America, but it was largely linked to that sort of sectarianism. But yeah, when it comes to the Minnicino essay, it was drawing on that sort of LaRouchian mythology, but really inserting it into the debate that was taking off. That's sort of similar to, I guess, the campaign against critical race theory that we're seeing today against political correctness. I mean, during the early 90s, you see mentions of political correctness rise from about, in 1990, there was only about 60 articles that were mentioning political correctness in the Nexus database. And when you get to 1994, it's 6,853. Mm-hmm. So it's so when Minnicino is contributing to this, campaign, it's really taking off, and various right-wing writers and think tankers, etc., are drawing from a whole variety of sources to enliven their kind of critiques of political correctness. And I think that people who are associated with Lind of the Free Congress Foundation encountered Minoschino's essay and probably didn't grasp that it had sort of Larouchian roots, but thought, hey, that this is a kind of neat narrative about how political correctness came to America. It doesn't. You don't have to deal with the actual history of the civil rights struggle, or the history of the New Left, or the history of various legislations taking place over the past few decades, and the changes in education. This is a neat narrative that we can pick up, streamline, and use to influence Republican voters, sort of agitate the base, and try to convince people who are undecided about what political correctness is all about. We really want them to associate it with Marxism, with this Marxist legacy, and this is where it really started to take on the much more explicit and specific anti-Semitic connotations, especially with Lind's links to the Liberty Lobby Network, especially American Free Radio and the Barnes Review, and all of those sorts of Holocaust denial outlets.
Great, thank you for laying all that out. Personally, I find it interesting that the genesis of this stuff comes out of a sort of pseudo-leftist history.
Mm-hmm.
And I see a lot of the same stuff going on today. I don't want to get into a giant discussion about third positionism or red-brown alliances, or whether Steve Bannon is actually populist or whatever, but because I think it's mostly rhetorical.
Mm-hmm.
And it's smart in that way, because the left is constantly critiquing itself and constantly having inner beefs between each other. And whether those beefs are legitimate or not, you can go in those spaces and pick up those beefs and then translate to them to a sort of conservative messaging campaign, which I've seen Trump do over and over again. It's actually quite clever, even though I don't have a lot of respect for his intelligence. I think, in some ways, the way he messages, or at least the way, the people behind him tell him to message is clever. And it plays into so much of what we talk about in the pilot podcast and why this stuff is potent, because it comes in the backdrop of neoliberalism, which is failing in so many ways, and people feel, it deserves critique. So when right-wing people can get good critiques of neoliberal politics from the left, even if they're sometimes aimed also at the left, they tend to be able to take those and run with it. And because I think they're addressing legitimate grievances, but then they flip it around in what I sort of call a bait and switch, and say, hey, are your wages low? Do you think there's not enough power in, elite spaces for regular people, et cetera, kind of populist language. And then they say, yeah, you're right. Guess what? Turn around and support ABC, Donald Trump, this authoritarian policy, et cetera, et cetera. And this is kind of the history of what I would call broadly right-wing populist, sometimes fascistic ideology. So I was going to play some clips from Len's video, but you should just look it up yourself. It's called The History of Political Correctness. You can also find threads if you look up William Lind and Sam's Twitter tag. Then I'm sure you can find the thread, and he has clipped
I'll
up
put it
in
in the
little
comments
pieces.
too.
Appreciate that. We'll put it in the description as well. And you can see how this language mirrors almost word for word, to the point where if I were Lind, I'd actually be angry about plagiarization of his work by people like Rufo and to some extent Lindsay. Word for word, it's just, instead of critical theory, instead of critical race theory, they just use critical theory and or cultural Marxism. And instead of wokeism or anti-racism and these things, they just use PC. And if you exchange those two phrases for each other, it's almost word for word what they were saying back then. Same kind of panic to, oh gosh, you can't say anything you want. This is going to be the end of civilization. Free speech is over. People have been saying this thing for decades and decades, and they said it in the 60s too. Oh, this is divisive. Well, not everything that's divisive is bad. Some things are divisive because people need to speak up for themselves and their situation and being oppressed, et cetera, et cetera. And that divides people. The civil rights movement divided a lot of people. So being divisive alone is not really an argument against these things. So I guess since we'll go through past Lind, making the connections with his PC sort of rhetoric, anti-PC rhetoric, and how it parallels today with the anti-woke rhetoric, anti-critical race rhetoric. Let's go ahead and get into, we already touched on Judeo-Bolshevik, and I mentioned we're going to talk about it some more. I want Andrew's, exact feelings about this, not just Judeo-Bolshevik, but cultural Bolshevism. So to be more specific, in my view, in fascist ideology, particularly that of the Nazis, but it goes beyond that. There are two concepts and phrases often referenced that I feel are relevant when discussing this stuff in cultural Marxism. One is Judeo-Bolshevism, and the second is cultural Bolshevism. Again, emphasizing, I'm not saying everybody who has used the term cultural Marxism unironically is a Nazi or a fascist, but there's clearly some overlap between all of these terms: cultural Marxism, Judeo-Bolshevism, cultural Bolshevism. So, Andrew, do you feel that this is the case, that there is overlap? Yes or no? Can you expand on these older terms, explain them a little bit, and where and why you feel like these comparisons are valid or invalid?
Thank you. That's a good question. I am wary of certain chronological and causal claims about the links between Judeo-Bolshevism, cultural Bolshevism, and cultural Marxism. There are sometimes assertions that it was just a simple rebranding or a simple updating, and that is all we can say about the origins of cultural Marxism as a term and as a narrative. And I think that what's probably a more accurate characterization of what happened was that there was a sort of entanglement between what was coming out of the Free Congress Foundation's attack on political correctness and cultural Marxism, and the work of the Liberty Lobby, who were collaborating with Lind, etc., in the late 90s. And what and for those who don't know, the Liberty Lobby was established by Willis F. Carto, largely based on the teachings of Francis P. Yockey, who wrote this book called Imperium, that largely sort of imported neo-Nazi ideas into America. I mean, you can look at that text and see how it is almost the origin text of not Nazism in America, but sort of a neo-Nazi approach. And so a lot of different Nazi tropes were then preserved in this sort of Liberty Lobby ideology, and goes through various different iterations. They also have some sort of interactions with the John Birch Society in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and also split off into a bunch of different factions, because some people don't like Willis Carto, some people do like him, and like any of these sort of extremist groups, there's going to be a bunch of personality issues. But they were also sort of participating in this scare campaign against political correctness in the 90s, and their claim was about cultural communism, which was really a which was much more explicitly indebted in form, in content, to Judeo-Bolshevism, cultural Bolshevism. And when Lind and the Liberty Lobby were working together in the late 90s, the Liberty Lobby people said, oh, this idea about the Frankfurt School, we'll pinch that, and just took it into their version of cultural Bolshevism. and this is what. Well,
Do we?
there was
Sorry to interrupt. Do we just want to give like a brief definition of cultural Bolshevism?
oh,
Should be pretty straightforward. Cultural Marxism may be a little more complicated, but
Hi, we can talk about Judeo-Bolshevism, which is a term that really started taking off after the Russian Revolution, based on a kind of interpretation of the conspiracist hoax protocols of the Elders of Zion. That talked about the various revolutions that were happening in Europe during the First World War and after it. So you have the Russian Revolution, of course, and the Asta Rebellion, and also another rebellion in Bavaria, and largely because, on one hand, anti-Semitism was quite prevalent in Eastern Europe at the time, and there were quite a number of Jews who were involved in communist parties in that period. So they saw these, they saw these communist revolutions as part of a much larger plot for world domination outlined in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this was also a narrative that was imported to America by Russian emigres in 1918 and 1919, and was largely the inspiration for the first Red Scare. And this is why you get a lot of anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic legislation against Jewish immigrants, because Americans feared that Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe were bringing communism to American shores, and also bringing communism in order to organize with black workers in the South with the international workers of the world. So there was a pretty heavy state crackdown based on this conspiracy theory, and it really provides a good. I mean, that history is sort of what informs the origins of the FBI, and especially how J. Edgar Hoover perceived his role in protecting America and from what. Cultural Bolshevism is kind of an outgrowth of Judeo-Bolshevism. I guess it's an aspect of it, or a different version of it, and it's predominantly linked to racialist accounts of modernist art. So you have Nazi ideologues like Alfred Rosenberg, who is playing with this idea of racial aesthetics. Certain races produce certain kinds of art and preserve certain kinds of culture. The whites, the Aryans, they are the culture builders, whereas in the narrative of cultural Bolshevism, the Jews are the culture destroyers. Everything that they do is just there to destroy the culture of the whites, especially through their distorted art forms like expressionism, etc., and various forms of literature. And this is what fuels Nazi initiatives like the Degenerate Art Museum. This is why they were burning books, and also why when they invaded other nations, they were very interested in sort of rounding up theater makers and artists and all of that sort of stuff, because they saw these cultural forms as a kind of incubator for Bolshevism and an inherent sign of Jewishness. So these are the kinds of ideas that. So these are sort of two definitions of Judeo-Bolshevism and cultural Bolshevism, and what Francis Parker Yockey took up in Imperium was that Alfred Rosenberg's idea about racial aesthetics and particular races producing particular kinds of culture, and this is what. And so just to fast forward to the late 90s again, this is the kind of narrative that the sort of early versions of cultural Marxism was sucked into and used to inform other sort of far right groups around the world. And you can see links between this kind of much more explicitly anti-Semitic and xenophobic version of cultural Marxism that informed Anders Breivik. You can see it in the British National Party and their versions of it. But yeah, I think where I stand is that I object to certain causal claims about it, but I just want to point out that there are points where they are intertwined, even if they really do start out as different ideas.
Great. Thank you for sharing all that. So, again, I was going to play some of the stuff from William Lind and the Free Congress Foundation. We'll just, I'll probably re-record this and just like slice some stuff in before I throw it back up on YouTube before the end of the week, just to give the context, because like a lot of these sound bites are really crucial to understanding. But from memory, if you can, and either one of you guys, let's get into a discussion about, because full disclosure, I have plenty of, I wouldn't call it critiques because I'm not a philosopher, I'm not well versed in these things, but I would just call it skepticisms about critical race theory, what James Lindsay might broadly call grievance studies or whatever. You know, I've learned a lot from, you know, just in undergrad, like learning like surface level from some of these classes. I certainly do not reject all of it, but I have some of my own criticisms. But when I hear people like Lind or Rufo start critiquing these things, it's just like completely crazy. It's out of left field. So how do we separate reasonable criticisms where we can have a dialogue about these ideas? Because, you know, people are concerned about what might be going on at their job or their school or whatever. And that's okay. We can have conversations. But, you know, how do we warn people about like, this is batshit, this is propaganda, this is anti-Semitic, et cetera, versus, you know, what is a decent critique of these things? Do y'all have some critiques of any of these ideas? You know, I know it's a huge, broad thing that I'm referring to, so maybe you can just like pick one thing or talk about critical race theory or feminist studies or whatever. Do you have criticisms that you think are reasonable that are different from like the kind of monolithic attacks that are leveled by people like at critical race theory, critical theory, by people like William Lind or Chris Rufo?
I definitely do. But I have kind of I don't know. I feel like I have maybe a lot to say on this. Andrew, do you want to go first?
I mean, apart from reading the Crenshaw essay, I've never really engaged with critical race theory in much depth because I'm not a legal scholar in that sense.
Right.
I mean, I have some awareness of, you know, the various works associated with it, and since this whole sort of propaganda campaign got started, I've, you know, learned specifically what what critical race theory is. But I think that when it comes to like stuff like diversity or anti-racist training, there is a lot of clouding the issue about where it was, how it came to be, and how much like critical theory or critical race theory has really informed its practices. And I mean, these sorts of training initiatives really got going after like the 60s and 70s, in response to like the civil rights legislation, when white workers and black workers were working in integrated workplaces, and there were more instances of discrimination, but because of that, and so they brought in, so different companies and factories brought in these kinds of diversity or sensitivity training. And really, one of the, I think the setbacks of this kind of training is that they were discouraged from talking about the systematic effects or forms of racism, and it became much more it became much more focused on like psychological attitudes and individual biases. And as a handful of studies have shown, this kind of way of dealing with racism in the workplace is sometimes not that successful. Sometimes it can be actually counterproductive. And it has really nothing to do with like the history of critical race theory, but it has to do with how practices of diversity training developed over the latter half of the 20th century. And I don't think that these forms of diversity or anti-racist training are inherently bad. I think that in some circumstances and for various reasons, they have not been as successful because they have sort of been constrained from really dealing with the roots of racism in American society.
Yeah. I echo everything Andrew just said. I think that's definitely a worthwhile critique of the sort of thing that is often called critical race theory that is, in fact, not critical race theory. But to answer the question about how to separate the genuine criticisms. So, I mean, that's definitely one important point, is to make sure that we're actually talking about whatever it is that is being objected to, right? We're not talking about critical race theory when we're talking about these sorts of diversity trainings that don't work and sometimes, as Andrew said, can be counterproductive. One reason you might think that they aren't designed to actually be effective is because then if everyone could get one dose of diversity training, then the diversity trainers have no more work to do. So, I mean, in a sense, there is kind of an incentive to not actually fix the problem so that these people can continue to go around and get their business. So that's the sort of thing that, you know, your Robin DiAngelo's and those types of, you know, people are doing. But still, I think, yeah, sure, there is genuine criticism to be leveled at these kinds of fields and bodies of scholarship that Lindsay and Pluckrose call grievance studies. The most important step in making sure that one's criticism is genuine and not, you know, part of a bad faith propaganda campaign is to make sure that we actually have our targets correct. That whatever is actually being criticized is actually, you know, an honest representation of the scholarship as it is written, and not, you know, some caricature of it that is just easy to posture up as a straw man and then burn down for political points. So that's the most important part. But then, you know, once you have your actual target identified and locked in, then all sorts of criticisms can be leveled. You know, I mean, people come from different schools of thought. People have different models for understanding the social world, different models for understanding racism, classism, sexism, right? Within feminist studies, there's a huge amount of internal debate about what sort of approach is the right way to dismantle the patriarchy or achieve gender equality. And so, yeah, I mean, like you don't necessarily have to go outside of the field to find the critiques. These people are engaging in arguments against one another frequently in the literature. So if you have the ability to access their scholarship, you know, and obviously I'm not endorsing anything illegal, but there's a website that exists called Sci-Hub, and you know, go see what people are saying. Obviously not on Sci-Hub, you know, pay full price for the journal articles, obviously. But yeah, I mean, that you just make sure that the target is actually what people are claiming it to be. You know, do fact check, especially with these culture warriors like Lindsay and Pluckrose, who so much of their work is just done by expecting their fans not to fact check them because they have this claim of expertise because, oh, we read the crazy postmodern literature, so you don't have to. And so they just coast on that and get away with a whole bunch of misrepresentation and distortion and, you know, arguably slander of certain scholars because they can rely on their fans not doing the fact checking.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure we have enough time to get into some of your more recent work. Just sort of touch on some basics about your criticisms of Lindsay and Rufo, and maybe take a question or two if anybody's interested at the end. But while we're on the subject, it's interesting. One of the reasons that I had a sort of like anti-woke somewhat outlook for a while is because my conception of what woke meant was probably different from a lot of other people. It wasn't just like this generic social justice, racial justice thing. It was, in my mind, woke meant, to some extent at least, sort of neoliberal identity politics. And we talk about diversity training, and even though stuff isn't critical race theory most of the time, like it all gets lumped together in these conversations, so it's hard to not talk about these things. And my partner, the host of the show, Erin, I'm not sure if she's still listening or not, but she went through a situation where, and this has just sort of gotten more complicated in the last few days. We moved out here to Colorado so she could take this job at International Rescue Committee. It's an international NGO. And she was working with refugees, et cetera, et cetera. This is her background. She has a graduate degree, blah, blah, blah. And this is also when the pandemic and Black Lives Matter and everything started. And they were hitting her with a lot of diversity rhetoric, on one hand. On the other hand, their behavior was not reflecting that this was the values of the organization. And so we'll get more into that in a minute, but I think just like on the surface, this is part of the problem. Even though we diverge as leftists and right-wing people in huge ways about what to do about racism and et cetera, sometimes when, people see an organization engaging in these activities, they can just sort of see through the BS and see that this organization has no actual investment in this concept. This is all about CYA and PR, cover your ass, public relations, and it's a way of also sustaining an industry. Like we talked about, one of the problems with diversity training is that it sort of sustains itself if it doesn't solve the problem. And this is the problem with a lot, I think, of humanitarian and charity stuff. So just in general, I wanted to interject that part of it. Maybe we can have Erin speak to that a little bit and just like interject. I think we're going to do this a lot in part 2, which I forgot. Sorry to mention. This is a 2-part series. Next Sunday, 2 weeks from now, we're going to have Dr. Nathan Cartagena back to really flesh out some critical race theory definitions, et cetera, and get into the international aspect of this, how it ties into international development, humanitarianism. But with that said, I want to interject the concept of neoliberal identity politics, especially because Nathan brought it up with us in our sort of pre-interview talk. I feel more comfortable bringing it out and not only talking about critical race theory and how all the anti-critical race theory stuff is, bad or conspiratorial, monolithic, whatever you want to say, because I think this is part of the equation here is when people like Biden say you ain't black, and we have the wearing the kente cloth, kneeling photo stage opportunity, and even though there's a lot of talk, I totally think it's great that Juneteenth is a holiday now, but there's a lot of talk about how this is a symbolic thing, and this is about as much as anybody's willing to give because they don't want to actually engage in the real discussion here. And that, a lot of messaging around race and racism is superficial, and that it's not actually coming from where people say it's coming from. Can we have a discussion about that? Erin, do you want to jump in at all about your experience?
I can save that for the latter part because it's sort of my experience is just sort of illustrative of a little bit of like why we wanted to do this 2-part series, is dig into the historical context and then get into kind of like how it plays into what we're seeing today in culture wars. So I can hold off till the end if y'all want to speak to this and then get into, diversity training or my experience later.
I am curious about your experience if you want to touch on it at all. I mean, I could talk about secondhand experiences and somewhat related firsthand experiences in my training as a orientation leader at a university when I was an undergrad. But I am interested in hearing about what sort of your experiences with the pandering to diversity without actually really doing anything substantive.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so yeah, I started working at IRC in November 2019 and then ended up quitting in June 2020. So what was that, like 7 months or something? Pretty short stint. But just even within that time, so much happened. And it started in January where we went on a little retreat up in the mountains, our whole staff. And it was to get to know each other, but also we had to do sort of, some required trainings. And one of these was a, diversity training. At IRC, there's something called like the Racial Equity Collective, I believe. And that is a group of volunteer staff. I think each office or maybe regions has these teams or whatever that, like I said, staff volunteer for. And essentially it's kind of, I couldn't tell you specifically, but it's sort of like their job to kind of create racial trainings or sort of initiatives in the office where you can discuss either systematic, I don't even know if they would really talk about systematic issues or not, but maybe just like racial issues within the office or within at least the humanitarian industry. So anyway, in January, we had a training and the staff got to ask the executive director and the managers, like, why isn't there a more diverse staff? So IRC, is a large humanitarian organization. I was doing US-based refugee resettlement. So we're working with refugees from all over the globe, ethnically, racially, religion, language. I mean, we're working with, like I said, people from everywhere, but the staff is predominantly, young white women. And this is kind of typical, I would say, for a lot of humanitarian US-based organizations. And one of the questions that was really common that was asked to the executive director was, like I just said, why isn't there more diverse staff? And their response was essentially the pool. The pool is not diverse enough or whatever, which is such a bullshit excuse because Denver has I think the largest Ethiopian population in the United States. I could be wrong about that, but they definitely have a huge Ethiopian, Eritrean, Eastern African population. Not to say that those people all want these jobs in refugee resettlement agencies, because maybe they don't. But I'm just saying to illustrate that there is diversity in Denver, and to say that we could only find, young white women is, even if that's how they truly feel, it just shows that they're not going above and beyond to even try to diversify their own office.
And they don't want to pay either, which is part of it, which is why they get a lot of young white women into these free, unpaid internship positions, because those are the people that can take those positions.
Thank you. Yeah. If anybody hasn't read my blog, I have a blog about this on our Contrarian website. But yes, that's another thing. And this was even something that David Miliband or IRC said, that reportedly they were going to start doing paid internships. But then recently, at least in the UK, there was backlash about UK internships not being paid. This is a very easy first step, like Mikey was just saying, to increase diversity, to at least allow your entry-level positions for people to get a foot in the door, for those to be paid. Because again, most people don't take those positions because they're not paid, and people can't afford to have unpaid positions. So anyway, as we move along, the pandemic hits, we start to work remotely. George Floyd happens, and it becomes even more apparent that the organization is just trying to cover their ass. Because already, like I said, we had this diversity training in January. The executive director said they would work harder to increase diversity. No people of color or refugee, different immigration statuses were hired from January to June when I quit. And people were hired during that time, and it was white women. So that's another thing. And also during this time, one of the only Black women in the office was fired and not given a valid excuse. Because also this is another thing, is that you could be fired at will at a humanitarian organization, which is something I didn't know until it happened to my friend. So they were hiring white women, fired one of the only Black women in the office. And then, George Floyd happens. And as an organization, they start to pick up on Black Lives Matter rhetoric and all this stuff. And so then we have to have more racial equity trainings. Now it's like a required thing organization wide. And David Miliband, the CEO, is doing these like morning meetings, which he already was doing because of the pandemic and everybody was working remote. But then he started taking questions specifically about diversity education and what the organization should be doing to address systematic racism. And it was huge. So many employees were asking questions and wanted to know what the organization would be doing, because most IRC offices are either in Africa or the United States, with obviously huge Black populations. And so it's just so obvious it's obvious when any CEO is talking about racial equity, but it is so, on the nose ridiculous when a humanitarian organization is talking about it, about systematic injustices, and we're not dealing with any of the systematic issues within our own organization. They still want to peddle out kind of, I think what Andrew is talking about, like more like psychological interpersonal race relations, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because obviously racism exists at an organizational level. Trust me, I know that was another thing that was going on in my own office. But we also need to do systematic, decolonization, history, understanding, strategy, organizing work, all of these things. And they just didn't want to hear it. And in fact, at one of the like racial equity trainings that I did, our executive director was essentially, just kind of giving the basic logistics about IRC, its operating budget, how many people work there, and blah, 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 blah. And, then they start getting into, again, it just was so apparent that they didn't want to touch on the systems, because I had to kind of educate people there. And I'm, not a huge expert on this, but even about the funding streams, where IRC is getting its money and where a lot of these institutions are getting their money from. And they're getting their money from the government. And, it's not just private donors. They're getting money from the government to do specific things. And a lot of this government funding, like the DFID, I think is the one in UK, gives a huge sum to IRC each year. And a lot of the DFID's funding, which is like, Andrew, maybe you know this, that I can't remember the acronym, but it's the UK's international development sort of like government entity branch. And they give IRC money. And a lot of that funding originally came from the slave trade, just like a lot of development funds that governments have originally come from the slave trade, because that's how they were, Western imperial powers were making so much of their money. And then because they fucked everything up, they're like, oh, well, we'll have development, organizations that will civilize these people, or, what the fuck ever. So that's how a lot of these development funds get started. It's funneled into humanitarian agencies, which inevitably kind of carry out imperialistic desires. And they don't want to talk about that at all. And so it's been a huge thing. And just now there's a piece that Mikey has up, David Miliband Charity pushes white supremacy culture, workers allege. And this whole thing is just about like my whole experience, like workers trying to speak out to get actual change and not bullshit diversity trainings. And it also talks about, them workers being harassed, which did happen to me. That was another thing that was going on. So, yeah, I'm happy that this article came out because what happened to me apparently has happened to a lot of people. I already knew that because I have friends that this has happened to in the office I worked with. And now knowing that it's going on throughout the organization has been sad, but also validating.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know how, sorry, that was a bit long, but that's just kind of.
No, it's interesting because it sets up really well the contrast between actual critical race theory and what is often being called critical race theory. That's really just these sort of bullshit diversity trainings. The way that I tend to set things up is really sort of the way that you did in establishing the contrast between critical race theory, the main focus of which is systemic racism, institutional racism, structural disadvantage that results from historical injustices, and that being what critical race theory exists in order to explain and illuminate, versus this kind of D'Angelo-esque white fragility, psychological implicit bias, all of these very narrow individualistic frameworks for explaining racial tension or microaggressions or whatever it might be, which of course are worth exploring. But if you want to get a good understanding of sort of the existence of racial injustice on a large scale, are just really not going to illuminate much of anything. And so it is telling that is the stuff that gets associated with critical race theory the most in the public eye. That's the stuff that's easiest to demonize. This whole, white fragility. Oh, all white people are racist. This white supremacy culture type of way of trying to communicate things that's, I think, usually well-intentioned, but doesn't have positive effects, doesn't improve, race relations in the workplace, and really does not give anyone doesn't really improve anyone's base of knowledge of how racism exists and continues to plague our society, not only in the US, but across the world. And so it's a challenge, getting people to stop associating critical race theory with that stuff, which is the stuff that people are actually afraid of, right? People are saying, oh, they're teaching critical race theory to my kids. Oh, they're going to, they're saying all white people are racist to these, kindergartners or whatever. And that, that stuff it's usually not even that extreme in the diversity training world, but that's where you get those kinds of ideas. It's not critical race theory scholarship from, academics in peer-reviewed journals and such. It's these diversity trainers who get to sort of make up their platform that they want to sell, and it often seems like it's just a sort of game of who can one up. How can we be more woke, right? But woke in this very fast food woke kind of sense, where it's it's nothing substantive. It's not going to sustain you. There's no nutrients. It's just sort of, it's bullshit is what, it's not, it's candy.
I'm enjoying this conversation. And especially in lieu of not being able to play all the clips and everything, And in general, leading up to this episode, things have been moving so fast. I first conceived this episode a few months ago, and I probably would have done it a little bit differently had it been then. But it's amazing how fast messaging works, how quickly this conversation is evolving.
How Fox News has mobilized.
Yeah. But this part of the conversation, to me, it's like this is, at least for people in the reasonable sphere who are not freaking out about this, who want to have discussions, this is sort of part of the next, I think, step of this discussion. I think we'll leave some of that more for part 2. Andrew, did you have any reflections on this kind of stuff that you wanted to add, or unmute?
Unmuted, yes, indeed. I've been very interested to hear what other people have had to say, and I don't have anything else to contribute. But I think the points that you've all raised are excellent. I think I'm interested to hear more about this sort of stuff.
Cool. Well, we'll definitely get into that more next week. I think when Nathan's here, I'm gonna have to ask him to define what he means by neoliberal identity politics, and how he differentiates that from, what people on the right just sort of disparagingly think of as woke or, bad anti-racism, which is all anti-white. Which is, just to bring it up while I'm thinking of it, again, I'm not saying everybody who's engaging in this stuff is fascist or Nazi or whatever, but you just got to be aware why this sets off red flags for people. Anti-racist is a code for anti-white is literally a white supremacist phrase from a couple decades ago. Mm-hmm. So now that all the anti-woke people are trafficking in essentially what is word for word a mantra that comes from white supremacists, it raises certain red flags for some people, including myself, Jewish people who have studied these kinds of things. So that is part of the context. So it's not like every time somebody disagrees with you, they're calling you a Nazi. It's just like we can't... I do see why people get turned off by that, but then there's the other side of this conversation where it's like, if we talk about slavery on history.com Facebook page, there's like 150 angry rednecks that are saying this is divisive. This is why are you trying to tear America apart? Everybody else did slavery too. And it's just crazy. You know, slavery is part of American history. It's something we have to discuss. It has unique aspects to it as an American institution that make it different, potentially more brutal than other things, all these kinds of things. It's a part of our history, and people take this one thing that says, you think everybody who disagrees with you is a racist or a Nazi, and that, there's this other extreme of, I don't want to hear anything about racism ever again because you're saying that I'm a bad person, you're saying and that we can't do that. And we can't cede ground in that area. So with that said, I think we'll just move on to, while we have time left, let's get into Sam's sort of expertise here. I'm going to give a little introduction and say, I think I came across James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian in a similar way that you did. These are two of the three academic hoaxers, if you haven't heard, the third being Helen Pluckrose. What they did was make a bunch of journal entries, like academic papers, and try to get them into humanities peer-reviewed journals to show fake papers, to show that these journals don't have rigor, et cetera, et cetera. I saw James Lindsay and Boghossian probably in some YouTube clip of like a little cutout of Rogan.
Them on Joe Rogan, yeah.
Exactly.
That's how I first saw him too.
Exactly. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And, I have a little bit of disdain for academia and high-minded theory stuff that goes too far. I've been a little bit in that space, not super hardcore, but I went to graduate school for art and design, and there's a lot of theory, and there's postmodernism and all these kinds of things. And sometimes it just gets wacky and silly, and people act like it's serious when it's not. So I thought, oh, this is funny. They're showing, how ridiculous academia can be sometimes. And I think a lot of people bought into it on first glance.
First glance, yeah.
And then you dig a little deeper and realize, oh, there's a lot more to this. We don't have to go super into the grievance or the hoax papers. You can if you want. But you started looking into that. There's a number of things written. You can Google and find stuff about that. But then they came out with a book called Cynical Theories that you have done a review of, and you've also done a review of some of Christopher Rufo's journalism and video work. So if you want to talk about, what you found, like maybe some of the most egregious distortions that you think are worth informing people about, and I'll let you take the mic on that one.
Yeah, so I mean, there's so much to say here. I won't go too deep into the grievance studies papers themselves, but I think it's worth that people should go investigate that for themselves, because one thing that I found very quickly was that the representations that they were giving in interviews, like on Joe Rogan, like on other what are these other platforms? They talked to Jordan Peterson. They were on his YouTube channel. They've talked to Thaddeus Russell. They've talked to plenty of, you can find any people who are interviewing the anti-woke crowd generally. I forget, there's these like two British guys, but I forget their name. But they do it too. And whenever you go and listen to what it is that they're claiming that these hoax papers argued, I please just never take it at their word. Go and read the papers for yourself and see if that is if the papers are really as ridiculous as they make them claim. One of the ones I read specifically, I think it's called "When the Joke is on You" or "When the Hoax is on You" or something like that. And they claim that they argue in this paper that you can never make fun of social justice scholarship, and that sort of speech should be banned altogether. And actually, you go read the article, and it's a very nuanced critique of the power dynamics in satire and why it's different for, say, women to satirically make fun of male humor that demeans women than it is for men to just sort of satirically make fun of female mannerisms and that sort of thing. And it's honestly the best thing I've ever read from them, like writing wise. It's well researched, it's put together. It's not, it's not torturous to read. So definitely check that stuff out. And the reason it's so important to mention is because that entire project is what gives them this epistemic authority in the eyes of their fans to be explaining the scholarship that they go on to explain in things like the New Discourses blog posts, and several Aereo magazine articles where Helen was editor-in-chief, I believe, for a while, and isn't anymore since she's doing her what's it called? That new platform that she's doing. I forgot what it's called. Oh geez, what is the name? Something Balance or something. Anyways, she's onto something new now and doesn't do Aereo much anymore. But now that they have this authority, right? Since every time you claim you try to criticize James Lindsay or Helen Pluckrose on Twitter, inevitably some of their fans come, well, especially when, James quote tweets you from behind a block and I can't go and reply to his tweets, but he is out here, sending his minions to my page. Inevitably they write, well, how many articles have you gotten published? I think he's an expert on this stuff. He got these articles published in the woke studies, the grievance studies, and people conflate all these things, say that, he's an expert on critical race theory because of these articles that got published, none of which have anything to do with race. And so that's the really dangerous, or that's the really frustrating thing, is that they misrepresent these articles that they wrote that are, for the most part, reasonable, if at times somewhat ridiculous, but also some of the journals that they published in were journals like the Journal of Poetic Therapy. It's okay. I don't care what they publish in the Journal of Poetic Therapy. Yeah, it's peer reviewed. Maybe 3 people read it a year. So they weaponize this sort of false expertise that they've constructed. And this is one of the key tenets of, conspiracy theories and science denialism, is the fake expert. And in a field where, the real stuff is often dense, jargon laden, and is difficult for the average person, it's also not always accessible to the average person. They can then just rely on, the image of a Lindsay and a Pluckrose who has sort of postured themselves as an expert, having done all the work. Oh, we spent a whole year writing these papers, reading all the literature, familiarizing ourselves. And then you go into cynical theories, and they're making these claims about academics with no citations. And then I'm asking, okay, where are the citations for these claims? You say Foucault says that, truth doesn't exist and everything's just power. Okay, where? They list all the books that he has written. They don't give a single page number for any of the claims that they allege that he has made. They do this later on, especially the chapter that I went on to critique, chapter 8, where they claim that, nowadays it's sort of just fashionable in what they call this third wave of postmodernism. They say it goes, this was mostly Helen's project. And so James sort of signs on and puts his name on it to it's sort of a symbiotic relationship because James, has more of a platform than Helen. Helen sort of does more of the work than James. And so for this project particularly, they focus on postmodernism rather than the whole cultural Marxism trope. And they claim that nowadays it's just fashionable in the post-2010s zeitgeist, I guess, academic zeitgeist, for people to just claim that science and reason are just a product of Western white colonial males civilization. And so, we don't need any of those things and we'll set those aside and we need to focus on other forms of knowing, and that even debate itself and rational argumentation, empirical observation, the scientific method, all of these things apparently are said to be worthless. And their evidence for that, really, they base a lot of it on just absolute just perversions of interpretations of philosopher Christy Dotson. So those are really among the worst, where they argue that her notion of epistemic oppression commits her to saying that basically anyone who's not a white, straight Western male therefore has their own unique way of knowing. They throw in claims about witchcraft. When I critiqued Helen on this, she sort of resorted to the fact that she said, we didn't actually say that Dotson says this. What we said was Dotson introduces the notion of epistemic oppression. This is alleged to occur, right? So the use of the passive voice, which is huge and pervades the entire book and their writing generally. They'll use the passive voice so that they can sort of get away with these slippery, they can avoid actually attributing things to specific scholars and saying who said what in what text at what point. And they say, it is argued that, it is alleged that, all these things. And so the Dotson stuff is pretty terrible, but also their representations of the original French theorists, Derrida, Foucault, Baudrillard, but mostly Derrida and Foucault and Lyotard. There's one point in the book where they actually just like fundamentally misquote Lyotard and then take it completely out of context to mean something that he was. You can just look at the context and tell he was absolutely not arguing that. They use it to argue that he is claiming that the postmodernists don't care about finding out whether their hypothesis is in fact true, and that the truth doesn't matter and everything's just a function of power. Everything's political. But then they also say that the postmodernists themselves were not political enough, so that this new generation had to come in and politicize things. It's really a mess. And I feel like I've already gone on a tirade about it. So I'll pause here.
Sure. Thanks. Well, we didn't really touch on Rufo, but that's all right. Maybe we can do that later, maybe not. We're not really big in this on our show about just like going after individual people. It's tough with Rufo because he's so influential. He's had a major impact.
Yeah.
I guess since we're already talking about him, I'll just say, his distortions aside, which you can just go to Sam's Substack, what is conceptual disinformation,
Yep.
and you can look at it, his analysis there. In some ways, I have respect and appreciation for Rufo in a sort of Machiavellian way, because Rufo had a political project. And he acted on it, and he's been quite successful. Sort of in the same way that Randall Kennedy sort of gives it up to the critical race theorist as saying, look, these people were organized and disciplined, and they had, an idea about how to get their ideas into academia, and it worked. And you have to have some understanding and respect for that. So I wouldn't say I respect Rufo in that regard, but I do think, I spend a lot of time critiquing the left, man, and I try not to do it too much, but the left needs more political projects and less rhetoric and just talking about things. But let me be critical of Rufo at the same time, point out some hypocrisy. What's hilarious, and maybe I can bring this back to Andrew to get a little of his views on critical theory, rounding this out. And then let me go ahead and put this banner up. Anybody has a question, pop it into the comment section, and hopefully maybe we'll be able to get to it at the end. Part of the whole thing about the Frankfurt School and the leftists and all this stuff is they wanted to critique society and change it, which is okay, almost everybody does that. And that's exactly what Rufo is doing. And they want to talk about the Frankfurt School and post-structuralism and, postmodernism and all these, connections with communism, neo-Marxist, Gramscian cultural hegemony, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we can talk about the Free Congress Foundation, and we can talk about fourth generation warfare, and we can talk about the think tanks and the coordination that goes into creating this anti-critical race theory band, which is extremely tight-knit and very well funded. So, I mean, they're doing all of the things that they claim that the left is doing. And look, this is the reality of politics. People struggle to get their ideas out and to gain power and to get power for other people, et cetera, et cetera. And almost nobody operates ideologically in a vacuum where they hope their ideas don't have some kind of impact on the world and that they hope they don't take power in some form or another. So to bring that back in a little bit, when we were talking, Andrew, in our correspondence, you talked about one of the reasons Lind got a job, basically, why he was adopted into the sort of right-wing political operative sphere, and made a good living out of that, is because he was able to distill these complex ideas into sort of sound bites. And he does that with critical theory. And he sort of says, you said it to me in the email, so maybe you can say it better, but that critical is the critic part and the theory is this part. And what it all adds up to is, bringing down all of Western civilization. That's what it really means. So what do you make of that? Can you sort of parse out a little more nuance for us from what critical theory is and why Lind might be distorting what it really is?
Lind is largely resorting to these kinds of sound bites and buzzwords that you can list off the top of your minds. You may ask, what is critical theory? Well, it's actually a kind of play on words. The theory is to criticize. And his little thing about campuses becoming small, ivy-covered North Koreas. So really, when you're working as an intellectual for a think tank, your job really is to try and find ways to market these ideas, make them memorable, so they stick in people's minds, and that's what they use to describe the social reality. around
Marxism translated from economic
like,
into cultural terms. Yeah.
And you could see this sort of, and you could see this play out in the Heritage Foundation's video of critical race theory, of like there was critical theory, and then they just put race into it, and then in the film it's just inserting race right into critical theory. But that's like a memorable image of like you can now just like tell your audience, okay, so it's critical theory, but then race was added to it, and this is what is causing all of the problems that we're seeing today. And I don't know. I mean, when it comes to offering a proper idea of the Frankfurt School, I think that I mean the left is full of misconceptions and misrepresentations of the Frankfurt School as it is, completely separate from all of the stuff that the right is saying. You know, stuff about how Adorno was a curmudgeon who hated the student movement, even though he was actually quite active at certain parts of the student movement and involved and supportive of it during the 1960s. And also this whole notion of Marcuse as the father of the New Left is really more media hype. The media hype of the time, rather than an actual proper assessment of his influence. And also, when it comes to the Frankfurt School's influence in America post-1960s, I mean, it's really just a matter of two journals. It's the New German Critique and Telos journal. And I mean, if you're engaged in German studies, these are very big things, but like they don't have the same kind of concrete influence that's attached to them in these narratives. And I mean, I think over the past decade, there's been a lot of great scholarship on assessing the legacy of the Frankfurt School and their ties, and really figuring out the exact, extent of it. Thomas Wheatland's The Frankfurt School in Exile does a great job of looking at the Frankfurt School's time in America and what happened after some members left and also some members remained. There's also a great encyclopedia, which is pretty expensive but very good, the Blackwell Encyclopedia of the Frankfurt School. It looks for subterranean influences of the Frankfurt School, of thinkers who are not associated with like the second generation or third generation of the Frankfurt School, like Jürgen Habermas or Axel Honneth, but trying to tease out how other thinkers did take on Frankfurt School problematics and theories like Moshe Postone, Gillian Rose, and others. And I mean, I think when we were talking about it in our correspondence, I just pointed out that a lot of this is just very boring and sort of very intricate, and it can't be described in the same kind of sound bites that you find in Lind and Ruffo and Buchanan. I mean, I don't know if you mentioned Buchanan while I was gone, but he's someone else who's responsible for the promulgation of certain cliches about cultural Marxism.
Yeah, that guy's sheesh.
All right, well, nobody's asking questions, even though... Oh, wait, no, we got one. Let's see. Here we go. How is this live chat not an epistemological bubble in and of itself? Well, I'm not a philosopher. I'm not even 100% clear on what epistemology really means, but I feel like isn't every conversation between a few people an epistemological bubble?
Not in the technical sense, no. So well, I don't know what an epistemological bubble is supposed to be, but an epistemic bubble is a name for a certain kind of epistemic environment, you could say, in which the people who are the people in the bubble generally agree with respect to their position on some issue, and they don't hear the opposing side's position. So they don't know what the argument is coming from the other side. So if I were to say, listen exclusively to MSNBC content, and say my whole family did that and we never listened to any other news, we had no other news diet, and MSNBC wasn't actually giving us like the genuine conservative position on certain things, say they were exclusively straw manning or whatever it might be, or they were just leaving out their take on certain issues completely, then we would be in an epistemic bubble. So we would just not know what the opposing position is. But most of the time, people aren't in an epistemic bubble. They generally know what the opposing side's arguments are, unless they're really, really isolated. But yeah, so I mean, I take it that people here know what the opposing side's arguments are on things like critical race theory, cultural Marxism. We know what the arguments are. We've been talking about them extensively. So I don't know. Maybe the commenter meant something else by the phrase. I guess probably the idea that, I don't know, we all broadly agree when it comes to cultural Marxism being a conspiracy theory or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's it. There's probably considerable, I guess to a right winger, we're probably all the same. We're just a bunch of communists, but there's probably a considerable amount of differences in our political views, in addition to Dr. Nathan Cartagena, who is actually a Christian theologian and in addition to a philosopher and an expert on critical race theory. And while we're on that subject, just replug part 2, July 2nd, 1 p.m., right back here, same place, same time, Eastern, 1 p.m. Eastern. And yeah, and I'd love to have more and more views, but we're already doing a 2-part multi-hour series on this. Our show is mostly about humanitarianism and international development and whatnot. But I support everyone getting out of their epistemological bubbles. I think, let's see, no more questions. I'm going to give a little shout out to Andrew here in our conclusion and say he has a article on Commune magazine about this subject, cultural Marxism, and it closes with some of the best couple of sentences that I've read in a long time on these subjects. It sums up many hours I've spent trying to explain these things in a couple of quick points, and I'll even leave out one sentence about LaRouche and just say conspiracy theories are the lifeblood of contemporary fascism. Instead of dismissing them as fairy tales for white supremacists, we need to investigate the historical conditions that generated them. Fascism spreads whenever radical leftist politics is sabotaged, silenced, and suppressed. Whereas fascism constructs scapegoats, we must identify the true culprits. The fight against fascism is the first step in the fight for revolution. So I think, why that's important to me, especially like in the context of us discussing neoliberal identity politics, and hopefully we'll get into that next time, and Aaron's experiences in IRC, et cetera, and the personal, what we talk about personal versus systemic, and like trying to change people's hearts versus looking at, the systemic reasons these things are happening, is really a big deal to me. And just like pointing fingers and calling people crazy and saying conspiracy theory is bad, and it is, is really just the beginning. It doesn't really help much. We need to actually analyze these things and understand why they're happening, why people are buying into these narratives, because there is a reason for these things, and why they have weight for some people, why they stick, why what I call the war against whiteness, which is basically all this anti-critical race theory stuff, is doing a lot better than the war against Christmas, which was more of a flash in the pan culture war thing that never really got much traction. But I think in the world we live in, people want simple explanations, and the right is doing a lot better with that. And they know how to message around certain topics in a simple way that people can understand. We need to get better at that as the broader liberal left spectrum, in responding to these kinds of things. I will say I've been somewhat encouraged, though, by the general reaction of people actually understanding these things and pushing back and getting a nice, succinct argument against all this stuff that is already sort of taking part in the broader culture, and people are saying, hey, I see what this really is. You're just trying to get any talk of racism taken out of public spaces and whatnot, and like, this is not everything you're saying. It's not all it's cracked up to be in the moral panic that you're trying to put people in. So with all that said, if y'all don't have any closing statements, Aaron, Andrew, or Sam, I think next part will go better. We'll have the technical difficulties ironed out. I can play more media. People can see the John Birch Society stuff for themselves, the William Lynn stuff for themselves, see how similar it is to what James Lindsay and Chris Rufo and all these people, Andrew Sullivan, Tucker Carlson, and everybody who's trafficking in this kind of rhetoric, how much they borrow from these old ideas. And hopefully that will help demystify some of these discussions, and help people, get a better grounding on how to think about these things. I do appreciate both of our guests, Andrew and Sam, for coming on today. We'll see you again in a couple weeks with Dr. Nathan Cartagena, where we will be getting much deeper into the actual definitions of critical race theory and the history of it. In this episode, we did, have some mild criticisms of it. Maybe we'll bring those up a little bit in the next episode. But even as a critic myself, as I mentioned, or a skeptic, I guess you could say, I think there's so much good stuff in these fields, and not just critical race theory, but the undergirding philosophy that comes from these things, the Black radical tradition, decolonial studies, and beyond, feminist studies, indigenous studies, Latino studies, etc. And so what we want to do is say, hey, we've sort of examined this. We've talked about some of the maybe problems, why people are upset. Let's also talk about why these things have merit. What are the good ideas, and how do these things help us inform our understanding of, say, international politics, international development, and humanitarianism? So that's what we're looking forward to. In next episode, we're going to have an open-ended discussion after Nathan sort of schools us on some of these subjects, and Andrew and Sam will be back to take part in that. So thank you so much. If nobody else has anything else to say, without further ado, I think we'll wrap this one up.
Thanks for having us on.
Same, thank you very much.
Thanks, y'all. Take
Look
care.
forward to next time.
Oh, happy Father's Day, Howard, Stephen. We love you. We're going to call you in just a little bit. All right.
Yeah.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andrew and Sam. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Take care.